Good afternoon and welcome back to another episode of the Emerging Markets Entrepreneur. Today we have a guest, Rob Withagen, who is the co-founder and CEO of Asoko Insights, a market intelligence and data firm doing business in Africa. Rob, thanks so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Rob, for being on the show. Thanks for the intro, Sid.
Fantastic. So let's kick things off. The whole point behind the Emerging Markets Entrepreneur is to see how various companies are dealing with the challenges around COVID. So before we go into anything else, what has been one of the biggest takeaways that you've seen during this time? And feel free to take some liberty on how you respond to that question.
It's hard to give you one answer to that because there've been a lot of really interesting and also really, I guess, challenging insights. But if we keep it focused at my immediate work context, it's got to be the shift to digital. That was always happening, right? But now I feel 10 years of development have been crammed into 4 months, and that goes beyond shifting to Zoom for a business meeting, right? The entire premise of Asoko is based on and was established on the fact that a lot of the hard on the ground efforts that are going into data collection can actually shift online, and a lot of the due diligence that investors do with African corporates before they invest can shift online. Now, that was a difficult conversation to have with an investor 8 months ago, who had clear objections around certain parts of that just not shifting online. The need for in-person interaction at some point in the process. Right now, it almost doesn't need any oxygen anymore, right? If we stick to that example of an investor, people have just accepted the reality that is the only way to do it right now, and probably is going to be remaining the way it's being done in the future.
Rob, in that sense, thank you for kicking things off. Maybe you could tell us a little bit in that context what you're actually doing, how you got started, and what's the value proposition that you and your company have.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So we started 8 years ago with the vision of making African companies as discoverable and as easy to analyze as one would do in any other parts of the world. So I don't need to tell you guys, global data incumbents you've got your Refinitives, Bloomberg's, Crunchbase, PitchBooks of the world. They have big databases of companies all over the world, right? You're looking for the biggest FMCG producer in Brazil, it's a matter of seconds before you know who that company is, who it's owned by, who it does business to, etc. That in Africa has been much harder to establish, right? For evident reasons. The whole data landscape is challenged by particularities to the African continent, access to internet, governance standards, you name it. We saw an opportunity to essentially structure that corporate data space a whole lot more than any of those global incumbents had done it up until we came along, and still until today, I would argue. So taking some cues from data products, data solutions that we saw in other parts of the world, Zawiya in the Middle East is one example. We basically started with deploying people across the continent, building a brand among African corporates in order for them to be able to feed their data on their information into a secure environment, would be prepared, curated by us, by an objective team, and then presented to a group of clients that would be of value to these corporates. That is still the business that we run today. We've gone through a number of evolutions in terms of product and solution, but the core proposition is still exactly that.
So you basically, you're a data company. You know a lot, basically. Well, data is the new currency. So on a macroeconomic level in Africa, what are some of the trends that you're particularly seeing, especially versus the rest of the world? So what are things that you're seeing in Africa on a macroeconomic level that you're not seeing anywhere else in the world?
A couple of trends come to mind. I think first of all, the African middle class has always been looked at as this big gold mine, the whole Africa rising story. We've heard it a million times. Like there's this massive middle class, which is growing, and the big FMCG companies of the world are moving in to sort of find the final frontier across this big, almost homogeneous market, right? That myth has been largely deconstructed. And I think we're now a lot smarter as to what part of that middle class is really driving growth and what level of nuance one should apply when wanting to tap into that growth. Like a customer in Lagos is inherently different than a customer in on the outskirts of Addis Ababa. And I think so understanding that and putting solutions in front of that middle class that actually resonates, that fulfills a real demand, that is affordable, by that middle class has been something that Africa has been quite unique in. I think it's been a lot harder to crack than other emerging market stories like East Asia or Latin America, which the African story is often compared with. I think the last 5 years we've become a lot smarter in that, right? And a lot of that has to do with digital technology and digital evolutions. A lot of the consumers are easier to reach than they were 10, 15 years ago. A lot of them have come online and shared details and insights on themselves a lot better than 10 years ago. So I think the story in Africa has become a lot more nuanced and targeted to particular growth pockets that actually are in need of real products, and that we, from a supply side, are now able to provide much better, much smarter. That on the one side. On the other side, kind of related to this, is the whole digital shift, which has been a global development, obviously, but has taken a much more prominent and much quicker development across the African continent than we've seen elsewhere. This goes anywhere from fintech to how investors find companies, to how governments allocate support or scrutinize taxpayers. I think the impact of a digital transition has been a lot bigger across big markets on the continent than in other parts of the world, for sure.
So, Rob, tell me something about data. I think in conversations we've had in the past, you've told me that you've become one of the largest, if not the largest, repository of data on unlisted or private companies. What are some of the challenges associated with data collection? So, for instance, why would I, as a private company, want to give you data? What's in it for me, and what's in it for some of your companies?
And so I think you're hitting on the core challenge there. So in a lot of other markets, private company data, it's not hard to collect anywhere, but in other markets it's easier because it's somehow regulated under a national corporate registry and made publicly available. So you take the UK, for example. There's an API in Companies House, UK Companies House, which is the national corporate registry, and you can basically access any piece of information on the company's shareholder or address or CEO, whatever. Now that just does not exist across the markets where we operate, right? These corporate registries exist, but they're largely analog. They're certainly not accessible through an API. So a whole lot more preparatory work needs to go into identifying these pockets of corporate data that are actually useful for a company like ours to work with. Now, that is never going to give you enough of a solution to put in front of a client, because that data will lack a lot of depth, it will lack timeliness, so it needs a lot of work, and that's where the collaboration of the companies in question come in, right? Like you need to get more data from the people actually running this organization in order to come to a useful insight that a commercial client is willing to pay for or do something with. Which is where the incentive for companies to collaborate in building that database comes in. And I think what's been interesting for us is it's all about incentives, right? It's about, like, why do you build up a profile on LinkedIn, or why do you maintain any type of a digital footprint? You always have a reason behind it. You want to be found by people that you care about. And it's no different for the corporates that we cover. They want to be found by an investor or a global partner or a client or a supplier, or they just want to have a digital reference to point to when talking to their local partner, because it's considered sort of an objective point of reference. And these incentives are different for any corporate. I would go as far as saying for any executive that we sit down with. But there's always a concentration of incentives that work, and certainly that we've built an effective data submission process around. Hope that answers the question.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about digital transformation. We've heard quite a few people say exactly this, that we've accelerated 10 years into the future in the last 4 months. And that's from your business perspective beyond Zoom. How has digital transformation changed the way you do things? You've talked a little bit about data collection, but is there any other element that you see that, it could be an artificial intelligence or machine learning? Is there anything that you're doing in trends analysis or anything like that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I think the most tangible example we've seen is in an investor workflow. Like we're commercializing virtual deal rooms. We have been doing that for a while, and we certainly have seen a big uptick in the demand for that particular solution, where we're able to essentially call on companies to step forward with an identification of an investment opportunity, upload data in a web-based interface, and send that on to a group of curated investors that we know have an interest in that particular opportunity. Right? That's the only way investors can identify investment opportunities at the moment. Mm-hmm. In a world where not too many people want to jump on a plane, let alone sit at a restaurant table to kind of discuss opportunities. And it's one of the few ways in which corporates can actually present themselves to that financial community. So that's been a big observation for us, and there's a lot of room for growth there. Think of digital due diligence, digital KYC, which has already started at the consumer level, but has never really evolved into the corporate level. We're now rapidly running into that territory. Think of digital environments where financial statements can be shared with a group of shareholders or other regulatory stakeholders, which has never really been done with much conviction across the continent, right? Like for corporates to submit financial accounts into their national regulators, it's still largely an analog, a hard copy based process. We're now rapidly shifting to digitization of that. So also, when you think of corporate governance and transparency across Africa, you're seeing digital solutions making a significantly bigger impact than they did before the COVID crisis.
So you've talked a little bit about those diversified middle class and the pockets of growth that you've called it. So if you're an entrepreneur now in Africa, I have two questions. Number one, what are these pockets of growth? What would you do? What are the things that you would focus on? Maybe also in comparison to an entrepreneur in South Africa versus an entrepreneur in Nigeria. And B is, you have a lot of insight not only in the data of Africa, but also the investors' appetite. So how is the investor appetite for African companies? How has that changed? What are they looking at? And what are they focusing on?
Yeah, interesting. All right, so on the entrepreneurial side, I would focus on one of three sectors. And what I'm saying here is already happening, right? Like I'm not presenting you with a crystal ball of what is going to happen, but no, but so critical sectors, education, healthcare, agriculture, three sectors that have a real demand across the continent, right? And that need so much, or that offers so much room for improvement from where we are today. I mean, the entrepreneurial opportunities right across those three sectors are just tremendous, especially when we think of what digital can do. Education, I mean, there's no reason that, only 0.0001% of Nigerians can go to the UK or the US to go to a good school. If you can access good courses online in digital fashion, then all of a sudden that access becomes much more widespread, not just to the privileged few. evident examples, and that, that we're starting to see real good businesses around, but that I think have so much more room to evolve into businesses of much bigger impact and much more economic success than they're able to achieve today. On the investor side, you have to distinguish between, I suppose, a traditional private equity investor and a more trendy, in an African context at least, VC investor, right? On the private equity side, I think the big boys like the Actis, the Carlyles, the Helioses of the world, they've had first dips. I think they ran out of or at least that space, that tier one space, that big guys like that were able to find opportunities in, was quickly saturated. You've then, this started like 3-4 years ago, seen a regionalization of private equity firms that that understand that the volume of smaller ticket sizes, right, below the big private equity guys is actually much more interesting, needs much more of a regional understanding, and for that reason have encouraged a group of investors that is genuinely local, based out of Lagos, Nairobi, Joburg, what have you, investing, in SMEs, in particular the mid-sized companies. And that is happening right now. For these entrepreneurial projects that we just discussed, that's probably still a little bit too far down the line. You need VC capital for that. And I think that has been a particularly exciting story over the last 5 years, right? Like when, I guess, initially the VC based guys kind of understood vaguely that there was something going on in Africa, and incomes, I guess, traditional tech focused money, but that now also has become a lot more smarter and a lot more localized. And we've gone through the first few waves of VC-backed startups where we've seen boom and busts. I think there's a big rationalization in that space right now, and you see some startups getting to Series A, Series B, Series C levels, which is, again, those success stories are drawing in more VC capital and are enabling more African entrepreneurs with access to that startup money. It's been hit by COVID, right? I mean, that's probably been certainly from my perspective the biggest damage that COVID has done to the entrepreneurial space. It's just the immediate pause on access to capital, because a lot
more
of
in Africa than in the rest of the world, do you think?
I think so. I think, a lot of, even if the investment space is localizing, a lot of their money is still coming from overseas, right? LPs to private equity funds or backers of VC funds is still largely US, UK, France-based money. And in times of economic headwinds, those backers are moving away out of quote unquote risky territory and are focused on more safer bets, which has led to some impact on the capital that was available for Africa-focused funds, for sure.
So let's go back to the crystal ball comment, right? So let's assume that you do have a crystal ball. What does the future look like? We know what the immediate future looks like, but if you had to just close your eyes and imagine a post-COVID-19 world, what does that look like in your opinion?
What facet of the world are we looking at?
I'll give you an example to get you started off. So the importance of, let's say, business travel is going to diminish, right? So that's going to be the shocks to demand are not going to be recovered in any short period of time. So what else is going to change in your opinion? And you don't have to focus on data or Africa, but just how's the world going to change?
Yeah, well, listen, I think one particular area that you and I have, we've bumped into each other on the sidelines of a lot of conferences across Africa, right? I think that whole medium is largely gone as we knew it. I think it's going to be hard to imagine a world where you see thousands of people all traveling to one, big conference room to spend 3 days together. It will be some time before, I suppose, social distancing infrastructure will allow it. But even after that, I think people will have come to the conclusion that that's a very expensive way of trying to meet a few new people or trying to digest, bits of content that you're interested in. So I think, if we think of the whole soft networking skills around corporate Africa, I think we're going to see a tremendous shift there. And I don't believe everything is going to go virtual. I believe there are elements that need to be done in person, or that virtual solutions just can't replace. I think it's going to be a hybrid. And I think, the whole virtual innovation behind conferences is going to be evolving quite dramatically. But yeah, shaking hands over a coffee on the sidelines of a big African conference in Johannesburg's Radisson Hotel, like that's going to be hard to imagine. I think it's going to be somewhere in between, one-on-one chats like this, with then kind of shifting to a bigger audience where a keynote speaker holds his or her address, and then maybe the next day you're kind of recircling back to a smaller group of people that you've selected and invited to come have a more personalized chat. I think it's going to be much more of a hybrid, much more stretch out over a number of days, rather than everything concentrated on one big sequence of events, and a lot more driven by technology. That's for sure.
I think that's a great answer. I mean, we've seen that as a trend, as a broadcaster, as a media company. We organize a lot of conferences, and we did one virtual event on the 20th of August, where we had 2,000 people join, not from Africa but globally. More than half were from Africa, but from globally, and it was amazing because you actually had people behave exactly as they would in a conference. They were in the session, they left the session, they networked on the sidelines, all facilitated by a platform. So I completely see that happening in the future, for sure.
Yeah. No, yeah, interesting. Yeah, and maybe it makes sense, right? I mean, sometimes, and there's nothing good about this crisis, but sometimes these times really do give us a wake-up call. Like, does it make sense for thousands of people to spend thousands of dollars each on hotels and planes, and blocking their days from other important stuff?
Mm-hmm.
To be taking in knowledge and meeting each other. There are much more efficient ways of going about that, and I suppose this puts us on an accelerated pathway to really explore that.
Absolutely. So one of the questions that we ask experienced entrepreneurs on this program is, what are some of the advice that you would give either a startup entrepreneur or somebody thinking of going into business for themselves?
I suppose, if I look back at Asoko's journey, it's, and I'm not saying anything groundbreaking here, but really focus on product market fit before you go out and create a whole lot of noise, particularly in the eyes of an investor, right? Like, it's not hard to get FaceTime with an investor. It's not easy to get FaceTime with an investor. It certainly is not easy to convince that investor to come along. But what you wanna make sure is that you've got a tested model that has gone through some pains before you really put it in front of an investor, and you have not shied away from taking in critical client feedback, walked into a wall a couple of times, lost a few clients, and won some more before you go out and present yourself as an investment ready startup. I think that's critical. I've learned that lesson the hard way. I've also seen, and I continue to see, pitch decks out there as I gradually shift from entrepreneur to startup investor that I think need a little bit more kicking the tires and testing. So my advice would be, don't be afraid to make yourself vulnerable. Put yourself in front of a client, get genuine market feedback before you go out to an investor, and really try and do as much as you can before you bring in that first check.
I suppose it leads me to a good follow-up question. What would you do differently if you could, given the 8-year journey that you've gone through?
I think, we've taken inspiration from a couple of models around the world that operate in a very different time and operate in a very different geography than what we're in right now. And what I would do differently is probably be a little bit more critical to how those other models that worked well with those other variables could work in our particular geography. I wouldn't go as far as saying that, you know, we started off thinking we would be able to do exactly the same, but we definitely could have spent a little bit more time adapting it to the particularities of the African geography with its particular data sourcing challenges, and of the mostly non-African clients that look at that data to make important decisions. There's a lot of adaptation necessary that we now understand, but that has probably taken us a little bit longer than it should have to understand.
Mm. And I know, Sid, you're watching the time. We're running out, but one last question from my side is, you know, you've talked about the journey of entrepreneurship, and, you know, it's all these ups and downs, and especially COVID, you know, has shaken a lot of entrepreneurs. What do you do in order to stay motivated and in order to stay productive? What do you recommend other entrepreneurs to?
Yeah, I think, you know, this is a time where everybody spends a lot of time behind the screen, right? Like you don't necessarily have a hard reason to leave the room because nobody's meeting each other in person, and that can feel very efficient and productive, but it also catches up with you with regards to just, I guess, disconnecting and the need for human interaction, which is real, right? Which is a real need that we as humans have. So I think just making sure that a healthy proportion of your day continues to satisfy that in the absence of a colleague sitting beside you, that's critical. And whether that's done by, I don't know, spending more time on outdoor activities or just making sure that you have a hard stop at 6 o'clock where you log off work, that I think everybody needs to find their own personal rhythm in that. But even more time spent on a healthy balance between work and personal life, I think that's critical. It's tempting as an entrepreneur to just work and work and work. But if there's, you know, no difference between your office and your living room, that can quickly become a little bit too much.
Very
Nice.
wise words.
Now we're stopping with Rihanna, basically.
Great. Rob, thanks so much for your time. It was a fantastic conversation, and look forward to catching up when the world goes back to normal.
Yeah, man. Thanks a lot, guys, and good luck with the show.
Cool. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Sid.